The methods that Wundt's psychology used have the following characteristics. First, it was an introspection. Typically, when one considers that Wundt's psychology was a psychology of consciousness, or the immediate experience, as he called it, then the method has to deal with some sort of introspection. Well, in fact, it wasn't. So the studies that Wundt conducted were always objective. So it wasn't about reflecting or self-reflecting, observing your thoughts, your feelings, and report that. There was an influence from physiology in the sense that there was a presentation of a stimulus or stimuli. So the typical physiology experiments with, let's say, a frog and receive an electric shock, and you observe the behavior. In humans, it would be to touch the knee with a hammer and observe the reflex of the knee. Psychophysics also use methods that are similar to physiology. For example, the presentation of stimulus in, let's say, in your back, and then you were asked whether you received you felt two stimuli or just one, and that the response depended on how far apart the two stimuli were presented. So the methods used by Wundt were a little bit different. So it had the influence of psychophysics and physiology in terms of the presentation of stimuli, but there were a few differences. First difference, for Wundt, the participants of the study had to be trained observers, experts. In fact, Wundt himself was the subject of his experiments. As we can see in this photo, Wundt rotated with his team members to be the participant or the theoretician, the one who came up with an idea to test in an experiment. Today, this would be anathema. The participants have to be blind almost to the goals of the researcher in order not to influence their behavior. But in Wundt's case, the researcher, the participant, had to be should be knowledgeable of the goals of the experiment, because otherwise it couldn't be the theories, the psychological theories that Wundt and his colleagues have couldn't be tested in such a way. So this is the first influence. The first difference, sorry. And then the second is one related to no introspection. There were very objective measures that I will talk about in a minute. So there were a number of methods used by Wundt. Some were called reaction methods, and in those methods there was a presentation of a stimuli or a stimulus or stimuli, and then participants have to provide a response, and that response was measured. The time to respond was measured, and this is the measurements of reaction times. The reproduction methods were about memory, so presentation of some sort of information, and then it had to be reproduced. And then expression methods, participants had to make some judgment about a characteristic of a stimulus. So as you can see, this is not, in a sense, there is introspection, because you are presented with some stimulation, and then you have to make either a decision based on on your perception, your conscious perception of that stimulation, and you have to reproduce something or you have to make a judgment. But it was objectively measured. It wasn't a subjective report of the experience. So, Wundt's methodology went beyond physiology, in which we have a stimulus that produces a physical response, and psychophysics, and he received the influence from physiology from Wilhelm Wundt, from von Helmholtz, and the influence of psychophysics from Gustav Fechner. And in psychophysics would be stimulus that leads to introspection. What he called the psychological experiment was stimulus again, but then it could be reaction time or a simple quantitative judgment about a feature of the stimulus. But the most important difference is that a psychological experiment was guided by theory. So he was against inductivism. And that theory, it was a psychological theory of that Wundt had about psychological causality and how mental processes interacted. So in order to test those theories, there were two elements that were important: systematic variation of conditions and precise observation. So systematic variation of conditions is sometimes, let's say if it is a memory task, then and it's memory for words, then you vary the speed of presentation of words and you observe what effect that has on the performance, or you vary the brightness of a stimulus and you see how that affects the capacity of the participants to differentiate to different types of stimuli. And precise observation, we need something objective, reaction time, or some performance of accuracy. And then expert participants that know about the goal of the experiments, they know what they need to respond, but obviously what Wundt and his team rotated. So obviously there are some things that you shouldn't know, like for example, the words that you will be presented. In a memory task, you shouldn't know which ones will be presented, otherwise it defeats the purpose of the task. But you should be aware of the theory, because that influences what you need to do to perform the task. Now, in today's experiments, it doesn't happen. We don't have expert participants unless we study expertise. But otherwise, participants are as naive as possible.